the first satellite that noticed it wasn't designed to track monsters. And yet the moment the atmospheric burn pattern appeared over the Pacific, every thermal system aboard it began flagging the same impossible anomaly, as something entered the planet's gravitational field without any identifiable propulsion. It didn't crash into the ocean the way a meteor should have, and it didn't slow down the way any spacecraft would, because whatever had arrived simply stopped in the air above a cargo fleet before the shockwave from its descent shattered steel hulls and snapped communication towers across 3 nearby ports. Ships capsized without ever being touched, coastal sirens activated across 2 cities at once, and long before anyone could identify the source of the pressure bending the surface of the sea downward, the first shadow spread across the water in a shape no radar system could measure. Within minutes, emergency broadcasts would begin calling it a gravity distortion, then an attack, then something far worse when the ocean beneath it started to darken without any change in weather. And by the time the Global Defense Agency realized something was standing there, they were already too late to understand what had just arrived. Because whatever this was, it hadn't come alone. And this was only the beginning of a war nobody on Earth knew had already started. If you think this ends with a simple misunderstanding, you're going to want to subscribe now, because what follows isn't a battle for a city or a country, but something that forces this world to confront an enemy it cannot contain, negotiate with, or survive unchanged. The world noticed the wrong kind of darkness before they ever saw the man standing in the rain, because darkness that moves with purpose over water and refuses to be read by sonar triggers every alarm in the chain before eyewitnesses can speak. Coastal CCTV captured nothing but waves lowering and folding inward. Satellite thermal maps spat out a blank where heat should have been, and sailors on 3 cargo freighters spent their last coherent seconds describing a pressure like a fist pressing on the sea. When the figure stepped down through that pressure and onto the deck of the nearest crippled ship, he did not shout, he did not ask, and he did not look like anything a Navy lieutenant could place on a threat matrix. He looked like a man who had walked out of a different reality with his steps measured, and that measured step already split the world into before and after. Sung Jin-Woo understood the rules of engagement the way a surgeon knows a blade. He had no time for speeches, no appetite for spectacle, and when the newcomer in the blue jacket moved across 3 nearest sailors and broke every bone in the span of a breath, his hands were already checking for the signs that mattered. There was no fever, no alien enzyme coursing through the blood, nothing on the biometric scanner that fit his experiences back home, but defeat is a physical thing, and when he laid hands on a downed floodlit deck, the contract that binds his shadow system accepted the outcome. Extraction requires an end. The sailors were ends, and as their life left them, Jin-Woo felt the cold draft that precedes taking. For him, it was not triumph but procurement, the sterile choreography of recruiting strength by ending strength. And even as darkness pooled at his feet to form the first shadow, it obeyed only because the target had been conquered on a battlefield. The Global Defense Agency, moved like a bureaucracy, has to slow in its decisions but fast in available firepower, and surveillance drones painted Jin-Woo's silhouette 2 degrees of panic away from being labeled hostile. A GDA field commander authorized a precision strike, non-lethal suppression to isolate and study, because governments choose study before annihilation if they can afford the time. The drone volley shredded 2 cargo containers and killed nothing important, but it did change the fight. Jin-Woo did not flinch when armored rounds chewed timber. He wiped blood from his hands and stepped between the whistling shrapnel and the next group of survivors, because his priority was to secure targets, not to save face. That movement, protecting, removing, finishing, was tactical containment in his head, and the second and third shadows that rose from the salt-slick deck were proof his method worked even if nobody watching knew what to name it. Then someone who could not be contained by cameras arrived, because when an alien pattern of force meets a planetary sentinel, the sentinel does not check for a diplomatic channel. It enforces its logic. He came in a fall of wind and a blush of speed that fractured the sky above the damaged fleet. A man who had earned his place in headlines as a hero and kept it by being able to end any physical problem by sheer application of force. Omni-Man was close enough to read the GDA tags on the nearest surviving uniform, close enough to see men moving in ways panic bends them, and then he saw the shadow figures gathering on the water like a graveyard's congregation. He did not call out with soft questions, because soft questions do not fix things that change the physics of a coastline. He asked with a punch that knocked the nearest crane out of its mount, and the fleet that had been reeling answered by shuddering. Omni-Man's first assessment was clinical and wrong in equal measure, because he reads threats by their effect on people, and the shadowed silhouettes moving across the freight decks were not people as he knew them. They walked with intention and clustered with a discipline the dead should not possess, and that created an instinct in him that this was invasion, not resurrection. Jin-Woo remained, as always, calm, and that calm looked like indifference until it did not. He did not attempt to explain, because explanation is an invitation to be negotiated with, and he was not on a negotiation timetable. His movements got him between Omni-Man's strike and a cluster of survivors, not from charity, but because those survivors were the currency his ability required. Defending them was the fastest way to create eligible bodies to feed his shadow ranks, and a man who thinks in outcomes will sometimes choose actions that look like mercy to strangers and like logistics to the men who die for it. The clash that followed was not symphony but measurement, because both men were testing the limits of the other without committing to the decisive blow. Omni-Man swung hard enough to hollow out a hull, and Jin-Woo met that force with something colder than steel. He did not match strength for strength. He absorbed trajectories, shifted weight, and used momentum like a surgeon steers a limb. The shadows he had taken did not fight like trained troops because they had not been bred for planetary superhumans. They fought like obedient echoes of the dead, with small, effective motions that kept Omni-Man from crushing them all at once. For every time Omni-Man drove a fist through shadow, one of Jin-Woo's own moves found a weak angle on the faster man, and each tiny nick and bruise told the same story. Viltrumite durability exceeded what shadow fragments ordinarily overcame, and that mismatch hung in the air like a fact both combatants had to accept. Jin-Woo made no rash escalation. He did not summon an army to storm the sky because an army without procurement is theater, and a theater is how resistance organizes the world against you. He used the shadows he had and tried, tactically, to keep Omni-Man from seeing the larger play beneath his hands, to prevent the Sentinel from learning how his extraction worked by making the battlefield small and controlled. Omni-Man, reading pattern and reaction, interpreted containment as a threat of replication and moved to neutralize him. What looked like a single decisive arrest became a race to control the narrative of the scene, because whoever controlled the public framing would control the first institutional reaction: study, quarantine, or obliteration. When the first public broadcast picked up the fight, the reaction shifted from curiosity to hysteria in minutes, because people cannot reconcile the sacred idea of a protector with footage of that protector grappling with creatures that look like the dead and a man who is not recognized in civil registries. The GDA authorized escalation parameters it had rehearsed in secrecy and sent a warning across every channel it could scramble. Hold your positions, do not engage, and emphasize that no one on the ground is authorized to kill the combatant unless ordered. That word ordered would matter. Omni-Man, who answers to no terrestrial flag when he perceives imminent planetary danger, tightened his grip on the confrontation and forced the scale of the fight to tip into a public fight for which he would be the arbiter. The moment that undid any hope of a quiet containment came when a second, larger shadow detached and advanced toward the shore with a clarity Jin-Woo did not intend to hide, because it had been built from sailors and engineers who took jobs and mortgages and died on a deck that had been reconfigured. Sensors aboard GDA ships began pinging readings they could not validate and command channels filled with the same two words: unknown army. Omni-Man, hearing that two-word conclusion from men who have access to better information than news feeds, changed from observer to executioner. Without hesitation, he clipped Jin-Woo between shoulder and rib to send a message about what action the world would permit. And Jin-Woo, who does not waste energy on melodrama, let the strike land and plan the answer before the pain finished arriving. What followed was a kinetic escalation that could not be undone, because physics does not take apologies. Omni-Man flew with Jin-Woo still on his heels toward the first populated shoreline, intent on separating the anomaly from a population he would not risk, while GDA Command authorized countermeasures that included interceptors and a scramble of enhanced field units who had been promised the technical margin to capture, not to kill. The ocean behind them shimmered with the shadow forms that had been legitimately earned, and the cameras kept rolling as the world tried to name what it was seeing. In that rolling footage was a fact that would change everything. A Viltrumite-class superhuman lifting the man who had just raised an army of the dead and heading inland, and a government reaching for cuts it thought were theoretical. By the time Omni-Man forced the fight inland, the decision had already been made in his mind that whatever this man was, he represented the kind of planetary variable that Viltrumite doctrine did not allow to stabilize. He did not speak to Jin-Woo as they crossed the shoreline at a speed that ignited the air around them, because conversation is reserved for threats that can be negotiated into compliance, and what he had just seen rising from the ocean moved like an occupying force. Their descent into the industrial outskirts of the nearest coastal city came with enough kinetic backlash to flatten storage facilities and peel the roofs off warehouses. And before the dust could settle, Omni-Man had already moved to pin Jin-Woo against the reinforced concrete of a loading platform that folded like cardboard under the pressure. Jin-Woo did not struggle immediately because immediate resistance without advantage wastes mana and gives an opponent a rhythm to counter. And rhythm is how someone like Omni-Man turns a fight into a beating. He let the initial shock translate through his bones, allowed Omni-Man to believe the force had achieved suppression, and used the second between blows to shadow exchange into the position he had already prepared. One of the newly formed shadows from the cargo fleet, positioned by instinct near the shoreline, became the anchor point for relocation. And in a blink that registered on no GDA camera, he was no longer in Omni-Man's grip, but standing 3 streets away beside a terrified group of dockworkers who had fled the first impact zone. Omni-Man's reaction was not confusion but confirmation, because threats that teleport without visible technology are threats that must be eliminated before they can replicate their trick under pressure. He adjusted mid-flight, recalibrated the vector, and drove himself into the new location with a strike meant not to incapacitate, but to end the engagement by destroying the environment around the target. The ground liquefied beneath the impact, streetlights tore free of their anchors, and the shockwave shattered windows across 4 city blocks, which in turn created the exact battlefield Jin-Woo required. Panic creates casualties, and casualties create ends, and ends create shadows. A brutal arithmetic he had learned long before this world had learned his name. The Global Defense Agency, watching the exchange unfold through aerial reconnaissance, issued its first classified designation for Jin-Woo as an anomaly requiring live capture under orbital oversight, because they had already noticed the pattern forming at his feet. Each time Omni-Man's attempts to neutralize the shadow constructs resulted in collateral fatalities. Those fatalities became a resource Jin-Woo could legally harvest within the constraints of his system. Extraction was not magic, not in the way they imagined it, but a battlefield contract that recognized defeat as the threshold for recruitment, and the GDA's analysts began flagging a feedback loop that could only end with exponential growth if allowed to continue in a populated zone. Mark Grayson arrived not as a soldier, but as someone trying to keep his father from escalating beyond what the public could forgive. And the sight that met him was not the clean heroism of a contained villain, but a man in black standing in the center of a spreading stain of darkness that moved against gravity. Mark's first instinct was to call out, to ask Jin-Woo to stand down, because he could still read humanity in the way Jin-Woo positioned himself between Omni-Man's trajectory and the nearest cluster of civilians. That hesitation would cost them both the illusion of a simple resolution, because Omni-Man interpreted Mark's approach as interference and Jin-Woo interpreted Mark's plea as an attempt to slow the outcome. When Omni-Man accelerated again, it was with the clear intention of removing Jin-Woo's capacity to reposition by breaking the limbs that allowed shadow exchange to matter, and the blow that followed drove Jin-Woo through a reinforced parking structure and into the levels below. Concrete collapsed in sheets, vehicles were crushed into unrecognizable slabs, and the men and women trapped inside the building experienced the last seconds of a life that had never included monsters or monarchs. Jin-Woo rose through dust and falling rebar with his breathing finally altered by the strain, because Viltrumite durability was not something his shadows could simply chip away at without cost, and every exchange of force was beginning to accumulate a debt he would have to pay with mana. Mark descended into the structure with a different kind of urgency, because what he saw was not a monster commanding an army but a tactical operator using whatever the battlefield gave him to survive an opponent who refused to consider restraint. He tried again, stepping between Omni-Man and Jin-Woo with hands open, and in doing so forced a momentary break in the sequence that had been driving the fight toward a lethal conclusion. Jin-Woo used that break not to speak but to act, extracting the first shadow from the newly dead beneath the rubble as the system accepted the end of their struggle, and the thing that rose beside him carried the same industrial helmet it had died in, its eyes lit with the dim obedience of a contract fulfilled. Omni-Man saw the motion and made his judgment, because a man who can turn the dead into soldiers inside a city is not a man who can be permitted to operate while committees debate terminology. He grabbed Mark by the shoulder and threw him clear of the engagement zone, not from malice, but from the certainty that what came next would be fatal to anyone not built to survive it. The air between Omni-Man and Jin-Woo compressed into a corridor of pressure as he advanced, intent on ending the anomaly before the GDA could box it into a study, and Jin-Woo finally allowed the aura of his authority to bleed outward. The effect was not visible in the way a blast would be, but everyone within 100 meters felt the weight of something older than the fight pressing against their instincts, a Monarch-level presence that forced even trained operatives to reconsider their place on the battlefield. Omni-Man did not step back, because Viltrumites are not taught to yield to pressure, but he did register the psychological interference as a tactic designed to buy time. Jin-Woo needed that time, because extraction from alien physiology was not guaranteed, and if he could not defeat a Viltrumite outright, he could not claim what would make the rest of this war survivable. Above them, GDA Command authorized orbital surveillance and began preparing enhanced operatives for deployment, while on the ground, the fight shifted from an attempted arrest into an elimination attempt that could not be quietly walked back. Omni-Man closed the distance with the understanding that delay meant growth for his opponent, and Jin-Woo met him with shadows that had been legitimately earned in the collapse below. Their collision cracked the support pillars that held the rest of the structure aloft, and as the upper levels began to give way, the city realized that this was no longer a localized incident, but the opening move in something far worse. By the time the upper levels of the parking structure began to collapse inward, the Global Defense Agency had already stopped referring to the engagement as a containment scenario and started modeling it as an emerging hostile ecosystem. That change in language mattered, because ecosystems adapt when pressure is applied, and the analysts watching Jin-Woo harvest legitimate battlefield ends into obedient shadows had realized that every minute spent fighting him in a populated zone fed a growth curve no conventional doctrine could flatten. Their first directive to all enhanced operatives inbound was explicit. Do not engage lethally unless ordered. Do not create unnecessary casualties. And above all, do not allow the anomaly to dictate the terrain. Omni-Man did not wait for directives, because his assessment had matured into certainty the moment he saw the most recent shadow rise wearing the helmet of a man who had died 10 seconds earlier. He drove Jin-Woo through the last intact pillar of the structure, with a strike calibrated to collapse the remaining floors without vaporizing the target outright, intending to force a burial that would deny mobility long enough for orbital assets to lock on. Jin-Woo felt the concrete close around him and did not panic, because panic burns mana and mana was already being spent at a rate this world had forced him to respect. Instead, he used the darkness that had accumulated in the lower levels to shadow exchange to a position he had seated near the building's perimeter before the collapse began. Mark, thrown clear by his father's earlier intervention, hovered at the edge of the engagement with a view that no longer supported the simple story he wanted to believe. He had watched Jin-Woo reposition between Omni-Man's vectors and groups of fleeing civilians more than once, had seen the man choose angles that minimized immediate fatalities even as the fight made fatalities inevitable. And the contradiction gnawed at him as GDA transport craft cut across the sky above. The first wave of enhanced field units did not descend into the dust blindly. They established a perimeter, deployed sensor arrays designed to map gravitational anomalies, and began broadcasting a request for the unknown combatant to stand down for evaluation. Jin-Woo heard the broadcast and ignored it, because standing down without control of the outcome invites containment, and containment by an agency that does not understand your system is how you become a resource instead of an actor. He moved along the fractured street with his shadows, maintaining a disciplined screen, placing himself where Omni-Man would have to choose between a clean line of attack and the risk of collateral damage, and in doing so forced the Viltrumite to consider the political cost of continuing at full force. That consideration lasted less than a second, because Omni-Man had already elevated Jin-Woo to an invasion-level anomaly, whose elimination justified almost any immediate expense. Above them, the GDA initiated orbital surveillance that could track mass displacement down to the kilogram, and the data began to paint a picture none of their models liked. Each time Jin-Woo secured a defeated target and completed extraction, the resulting shadow registered as a stable mass that did not dissipate under kinetic stress the way a projection might, and that stability suggested persistence beyond the engagement. Cecil Stedman, watching from a command room that had seen more than its share of existential threats, authorized the deployment of a prototype suppression team, equipped with anti-mobility fields intended to restrict teleportation-like effects without causing lethal feedback in civilian populations. The team descended into a city that was learning in real time what it meant to host a fight between incompatible philosophies of survival, and their arrival shifted the nature of the conflict from a duel into a layered confrontation with institutional intent. Omni-Man engaged again with a trajectory designed to drive Jin-Woo toward the waiting suppression grid, and Jin-Woo, recognizing the pattern, allowed himself to be pushed along a path that would bring him into contact with the first enhanced operative. That contact was brief and decisive, because Jin-Woo's priority remained threat elimination over negotiation, and the operative's defeat satisfied the system's requirement for extraction in a way that alien physiology had not yet permitted. When the new shadow rose wearing the GDA insignia it had died under, the command room went silent for a beat that stretched into policy, because the implication was clear. Their own agents could become part of the anomaly's force if defeated in proximity. Cecil did not rescind the deployment, because retreat would concede growth, but he did initiate a study protocol that would prioritize data capture even as the fight escalated. Mark, watching the agency he trusted adapt to a reality it did not control, realized that whatever Jin-Woo was, He had already changed the terms of engagement by making every loss a potential recruitment. Omni-Man saw the new addition to the Shadow ranks and abandoned the suppression corridor entirely, because allowing Jin-Woo to harvest enhanced operatives would only accelerate the feedback loop the GDA feared. He closed with a level of force that fractured the street beneath his feet and forced Jin-Woo to commit more mana to maintain cohesion among his shadows. And for the first time, the strain showed in the way Jin-Woo's breathing hitched between exchanges. Viltrumite durability still stood beyond the reach of his current army, and until he could defeat one outright, the resource he needed to balance this world's scale remained out of reach. Cecil authorized a city-wide evacuation that would take hours they did not have, while orbital assets prepared to fire a non-lethal containment net calibrated for mass rather than biology. The shadows at Jin-Woo's command expanded in response to legitimate battlefield victories, moving with a discipline that unsettled even the operatives trained to face the impossible. And Omni-Man adjusted his approach to prioritize immediate incapacitation over strategic positioning. As the first evacuation convoys began to move, the sky above the city filled with the hum of incoming aircraft, and the fight below was already shifting toward a scale that no longer respected municipal boundaries. The evacuation order did not move faster than panic, and panic did not move faster than the fight that had already begun to redraw the map of the city into zones of pressure and collapse. Traffic choked arterial roads within minutes. Emergency services found their own routes blocked by civilians attempting to outrun something they could not see clearly enough to name. And above it, all the GDA's aerial units struggled to maintain a stable perimeter, as Omni-Man's renewed assault forced Jin-Woo deeper into an urban grid that had never been designed to host this kind of conflict. Every impact cracked asphalt into trenches. Every missed strike became a collapsed storefront or a ruptured gas main, and the unintended consequence of those failures was a battlefield that produced ends faster than anyone could process them. Jin-Woo did not look at the chaos with satisfaction, because chaos is only useful when it can be shaped into advantage, and advantage requires restraint in the use of power that could burn itself out before the decisive moment arrives. He moved along the edges of evacuation routes with his shadows, forming a lattice between Omni-Man's vectors and clusters of trapped civilians, not from altruism, but from the recognition that controlled defeat was preferable to uncontrolled slaughter. Each time Omni-Man drove an attack into that lattice and someone failed to escape in time, Jin-Woo was there to confirm the end, and the system responded with a cold efficiency that did not care about citizenship or intent. The first time a shadow formed from a municipal firefighter who had been crushed beneath a fallen engine, the watching GDA units understood that the city itself had become a resource the anomaly could legally harvest within the constraints of his ability. That understanding forced a shift in their tactical doctrine from suppression to denial, because preventing Jin-Woo from reaching the newly defeated was now as important as preventing Omni-Man from escalating the fight into something that would generate more of them. Enhanced operatives began establishing moving cordons around impact zones, dragging survivors clear, even as secondary collapses threatened to turn rescue into recruitment. Mark took to the air again with a different objective, because he could see the pattern forming in a way his father refused to acknowledge. Jin-Woo was not attacking indiscriminately. He was redirecting force, positioning himself where Omni-Man's attempts to end the fight would cost the city the most, and then converting those costs into strength he could command. Mark tried to intercept a strike that would have driven Jin-Woo through a hospital wing mid-evacuation, and in doing so, he forced Omni-Man to alter course, just enough that the blow instead carved a trench through an empty transit line. Omni-Man's patience was not infinite, and the sight of his son interfering to protect a man who was raising the dead inside a city hardened his assessment into action that no longer accounted for optics. He accelerated past Mark with a trajectory meant to break Jin-Woo's capacity for shadow exchange by targeting the shadows themselves, scattering them with impacts that cratered intersections and turned public parks into fields of broken earth. Jin-Woo responded by pulling the remaining constructs tighter, maintaining cohesion at a mana cost that began to accumulate into fatigue he could not ignore if this engagement stretched into hours. Above the skyline, the GDA's orbital net descended with a hum that vibrated through glass and steel alike, its parameters tuned to restrict mass displacement across a defined radius without triggering lethal feedback in human tissue. Cecil authorized the drop despite incomplete modeling on how it would interact with whatever mechanism allowed Jin-Woo to reposition, because the alternative was to watch the anomaly continue to scale with every legitimate battlefield victory. The net deployed across 3 city blocks in a lattice of invisible force that distorted the air where it intersected with moving shadows. Jin-Woo tested the boundary once and felt the resistance translate through the connection that bound him to his army, a feedback that warned of disruption if he attempted to exchange beyond its limits. He adjusted without hesitation, because tactical patience demanded adaptation rather than defiance, and began moving along the interior of the containment zone in a pattern that kept Omni-Man engaged without allowing the Viltrumite a clean line to the evacuation convoys. The shadows followed, their numbers now sufficient to occupy entire streets, and the public broadcasts that had begun as shaky footage became a continuous stream of something no one had language for. The irreversible escalation came not from a single blow, but from the accumulation of decisions made under pressure, because as the containment net held Jin-Woo in place, it also concentrated the fight within a radius dense enough to ensure that every failure had witnesses. Omni-Man closed again, with the intention of ending it before the GDA could lose control entirely, and Jin-Woo met him with a formation that had been built from sailors, engineers, operatives, and first responders alike. Their collision buckled the net's outer anchors and sent a ripple through the lattice that warned of imminent overload. As the first anchor began to fail and the suppression field flickered, the shadows at Jin-Woo's command expanded into the adjoining districts where evacuation had not yet completed, and the city realized that containment had only made the battlefield deeper. Sirens rose in a chorus that could not compete with the sound of failing infrastructure, and above it, all Omni-Man drove forward with a certainty that this had to end now, before the anomaly's army reached a scale that would redefine what defense meant. The moment the first containment anchor failed, the Global Defense Agency stopped pretending this could be resolved with experimental grids and enhanced field teams, because what had been an urban crisis was now registering on national defense radars as an expanding zone of anomalous mass that moved with coordinated intent. Civilian airspace was cleared by executive order. Military flight corridors opened over a city that had never expected to host fighter squadrons, and the chain of command that normally resisted GDA intervention found itself deferring to an agency that had been warning about existential threats for decades. The irreversible shift from agency oversight to national response came not with a speech, but with the arrival of the first supersonic formation breaking cloud cover above the smoke. Jin-Woo felt the change in the fight before he saw it, because new variables always announce themselves in the behavior of opponents who suddenly choose distance over engagement. Omni-Man, reading the incoming signatures through experience that predated most of the technology now arrayed against him, pulled the engagement upward with a grab that drove both of them through the upper levels of an office tower and into open air. The intention was not retreat but isolation, because separating Jin-Woo from the city's density would deny him the stream of legitimate ends that had allowed his army to scale beyond what anyone had expected in minutes. Jin-Woo did not resist the ascent immediately, because fighting for ground inside a structure that had already begun to fail would cost him shadows he could not afford to lose to collapse. Instead, he allowed the climb long enough to mark new anchor points along the perimeter where his forces had secured recent victories, and when Omni-Man attempted to carry him beyond the effective range of his existing army, Shadow Exchange moved him back to the edge of the evacuation corridor, with a precision that drew a sharp intake of breath from the GDA analysts tracking displacement events. The suppression net, already flickering from overload, did not extend far enough to block this relocation, and Cecil's command room adjusted their models again. Mark followed with a growing sense that the fight had slipped beyond any script he could trust, because the military escalation now unfolding would not distinguish between a villain and an anomaly when drawing targeting solutions. He watched as armored vehicles established a second perimeter around the district, their crews under orders to deny access to impact zones that might produce new recruits for Jin-Woo's shadow ranks, and understood that his earlier hesitation had bought time for a response that would treat both combatants as problems to be solved. His attempt to intercept his father again was cut short by the arrival of the first non-lethal strike package, a barrage designed to disorient rather than destroy. The disorientation failed to affect Omni-Man in any meaningful way, but it did alter the battlefield in a manner Jin-Woo could use, because the shock from the detonations collapsed a partially evacuated transit hub where rescue teams had been operating. He moved without flourish, prioritizing the confirmation of defeat over any engagement with the military units now attempting to isolate him, and the system responded with the cold acceptance of new shadows drawn from the fallen. Each extraction was legitimate, each addition bound by the same contract that had followed him into this world, and the army at his back grew in a way no general had planned for. Omni-Man saw the growth and abandoned any pretense of coordinating with the forces now crowding the skyline, because allowing Jin-Woo to harvest casualties created by their intervention would only accelerate the feedback loop into something that could not be reversed. He drove through the nearest formation of shadows with a force that scattered them across rooftops and streets alike, and the retaliation from Jin-Woo came not as a frontal assault, but as a tightening of the formation that kept the Viltrumite engaged within reach of targets he could not afford to lose. The strain of maintaining cohesion under this level of kinetic pressure began to show in the way Jin-Woo's movements lost a fraction of their earlier economy. Above them, orbital surveillance relayed a new concern that shifted the conversation from containment to contingency, because long-range sensors had begun to detect anomalies consistent with off-world observation. The presence of a coordinated, expanding force of unknown origin had not gone unnoticed beyond the atmosphere, and while the GDA could not yet confirm who or what was watching, Cecil authorized a standing alert that included protocols for extraterrestrial contact under hostile conditions. The military, now fully committed, adjusted their perimeter to account for a fight that might draw attention from threats they were not equipped to face. As evacuation convoys cleared the outer districts, the interior became a proving ground where every engagement risked producing more of the very force they were trying to limit. Jin-Woo's aura pressed outward in measured pulses, a psychological weight that unsettled even hardened operators, and Omni-Man responded by accelerating the tempo of his attacks in an attempt to break the anomaly's concentration before fatigue could become decisive. The city's power grid began to fail under the cumulative damage, and in the growing dark, the shadows moved with an assurance that cameras struggled to capture. The first missile battery was authorized for deployment not as a kill option, but as a denial tool, intended to reshape the terrain in ways that would restrict Jin-Woo's mobility and limit access to fresh casualties. When the launchers elevated on the outskirts and targeting solutions locked onto key intersections, the fight below was already in motion toward a scale that no longer belonged to a single nation. Omni-Man closed again with the understanding that delay meant growth, and Jin-Woo met him with an army that had been legitimately earned in the hours since his arrival, even as new signatures flickered on the edge of orbital scans. The authorization for missile deployment had been framed as a terrain denial measure, but the moment the first launch streaked upward from the outskirts, the fight ceased to belong solely to the agencies and nations involved on the ground. International monitoring stations began relaying data across alliances that had never before needed to coordinate over a single metropolitan incident. And within minutes, the signatures of multiple orbital platforms shifted from passive observation to active engagement posture. The Global Defense Agency, now operating in lockstep with defense ministries that had previously questioned its authority, initiated an intervention protocol that had been written for extraterrestrial incursions rather than internal anomalies. Jin-Woo recognized the change not by sight but by pressure, because the atmosphere itself began to hum with the passage of objects entering at hypersonic speeds. He had already begun to feel the cost of maintaining cohesion among shadows, subjected to repeated Viltrumite impacts, and the arrival of orbital assets meant a battlefield that could shift vertically in ways Shadow Exchange might not be able to answer without careful placement. He moved along the edge of a partially evacuated district, prioritizing the defeat of hostile operatives who attempted to restrict his access to impact zones, because each confirmed end still represented a legitimate addition to his ranks. Omni-Man did not welcome the intervention, because military solutions often created the very conditions Jin-Woo required to scale, and the first kinetic strike from orbit proved his concern justified when it collapsed an already compromised hospital wing that had been mid-evacuation. The devastation was immediate and irreversible, and before GDA Command could issue a correction, Jin-Woo had already entered the rubble to confirm what the system recognized as defeat. Extraction from human physiology remained consistent regardless of origin, and the shadows that rose from the wreckage moved with a silent discipline that no one in orbit could see clearly enough to understand. Mark arrived at the edge of the new impact zone with a horror that no longer had room for hesitation, because the intervention meant to contain the anomaly had instead produced more of the very force they feared. He attempted to coordinate with the enhanced teams on the ground to pull survivors clear before Jin-Woo could reach them, but Omni-Man's renewed assault forced the engagement back into motion. The Viltrumite drove through the expanding formation with a determination that treated the shadows as obstacles rather than opponents, intent on ending the source before the scale became unmanageable. Above the city, Cecil authorized a containment lattice projected from orbital platforms designed to restrict mass movement across a wider radius than the earlier net had achieved. The projection descended in a pattern that bent light and distorted sound, and when it intersected with Jin-Woo's army, the feedback registered as resistance along the connections that bound them. He adjusted again, conserving mana by allowing the outermost shadows to disperse, rather than forcing cohesion against a field that would bleed him dry if contested directly. The intervention changed the nature of the conflict in a way none of them could reverse, because the city was no longer the only battlefield. Orbital platforms tracked the anomaly's movements with increasing precision, and long-range sensors began to register disturbances beyond the atmosphere that matched no known satellite profile. The presence of a coordinated, expanding force on the surface had drawn attention from observers who did not recognize national borders, and the GDA's earlier alert for extraterrestrial contact shifted from precaution to probability. Omni-Man felt the shift as well, because Viltrumite doctrine did not ignore signals that suggested off-world interest in a planet under their watch. His strikes grew more direct, sacrificing positional advantage for attempts at incapacitation that would prevent Jin-Woo from repositioning beyond the containment lattice. Jin-Woo met those attempts with a tightening of formation that kept the Viltrumite engaged within reach of targets the military could not afford to lose, even as fatigue began to edge into his movements with a persistence he could not dismiss. As the orbital lattice stabilized and evacuation convoys cleared the final outer districts, the interior became a contested zone where every engagement risked producing more shadows. The first confirmed anomaly beyond the atmosphere resolved into a formation that did not match any human craft, and Cecil's command room went quiet as the implications settled into policy. Whatever was coming had noticed the army moving in the dark below, and the intervention meant to contain Jin-Woo had instead announced the planet's instability to anyone watching. By the time the first off-world formation resolved into a confirmed approach vector, the conflict below had already crossed the threshold where containment was no longer a question of equipment, but of time. The orbital lattice held across most of the district, bending light into a faint shimmer that marked its boundary. And within that boundary, Jin-Woo's army had reached a density that allowed it to move not as scattered constructs, but as a coordinated force. Streets that had once hosted evacuation convoys, now filled with disciplined ranks drawn from legitimate battlefield victories, and the silence with which they advanced unsettled even the operators trained to face the impossible. Jin-Woo did not attempt to break the lattice outright, because the feedback along the connections to his shadows warned of a mana cost that would leave him exposed to Omni-Man's next assault. Instead, he shifted the pattern of advance to exploit the grid's blind angles, allowing outer formations to dissolve where pressure peaked while reinforcing interior ranks that could maintain cohesion without direct contest. This adaptation created the appearance of retreat along some corridors even as the army expanded through others, and the GDA's tactical overlays began to lag behind movements that did not respect conventional unit logic. Omni-Man saw the expansion and recognized the danger of allowing a force built from the city's losses to stabilize into something that could threaten beyond it. His response abandoned any attempt to coordinate with the military perimeter, because every second spent waiting on targeting solutions was another second Jin-Woo could use to confirm defeat and harvest strength. He drove into the densest concentration with an impact that shattered a municipal water main, turning the street into a channel of rising steam and broken asphalt, and for a moment the shadows scattered under the force of it. They reformed faster than expected, not because they had grown stronger individually, but because their numbers now allowed redundancy in a way that resisted total disruption. Jin-Woo used the opening created by Omni-Man's forward momentum to reposition along the interior of the lattice, placing himself where the Viltrumite would have to choose between pursuing him or preventing the shadows from reaching a partially cleared evacuation point. That choice forced Omni-Man to split his attention for the first time since the fight had begun, and the hesitation allowed a new formation to advance across an intersection the military had believed secured. Mark, moving along the perimeter with enhanced teams attempting to deny Jin-Woo access to fresh casualties, saw the advance and understood that the nature of the conflict had shifted from a duel into a struggle for territory. The shadows were no longer simply reacting to impacts. They were moving with intent toward infrastructure that would amplify their commander's mobility if secured. Transit hubs, communication nodes, and emergency staging areas became contested ground, and each loss risked becoming a permanent addition to the army pressing outward. Above them, the off-world formation adjusted its trajectory in response to the expanding mass below, and long-range sensors began to register propulsion signatures that matched no human design. Cecil authorized a global alert that extended beyond the immediate theater, because the presence of an organized, growing force on the surface had drawn attention from observers who might interpret it as a territorial violation. The military perimeter tightened, even as commanders understood that every engagement inside the lattice could feed the very threat they were attempting to contain. Jin-Woo felt the strain of sustained combat begin to settle into his limbs, a reminder that mana was not an infinite reserve, and that Viltrumite durability still stood beyond the reach of his current ranks. Until he could defeat such an opponent outright, the balance would remain tilted toward attrition he could not afford indefinitely. He adjusted again, conserving strength by allowing the shadows to engage in staggered formations that kept Omni-Man occupied, without committing the entire army to a single exchange. Omni-Man answered with a renewed attempt to isolate Jin-Woo from his force, accelerating through the lattice's interior where its projections were weakest, and closing the distance with a strike meant to break concentration rather than bone. The collision drove Jin-Woo through the facade of an emergency coordination center that had been abandoned minutes earlier, and as the structure began to fail around them, the shadows advanced to fill the space left in his wake. Outside, the military watched as positions they had secured fell to a force that grew with every legitimate defeat. The dominance was not total, but it was unmistakable, and the city's remaining defenders realized that resistance now meant preventing growth rather than achieving victory. Above the cloud cover, the approaching formation shifted into a holding pattern that suggested observation rather than immediate intervention, and the knowledge that something else was watching settled over the battlefield like a second, colder lattice. Omni-Man rose from the wreckage with the intention of ending the anomaly before that observation became action, and Jin-Woo met him with an army that had been earned in the hours since his arrival. The formation above the atmosphere did not behave like any satellite cluster or observational array the Global Defense Agency had cataloged, because it adjusted position in response to developments on the surface, with an intent that suggested command rather than curiosity. Long-range sensors struggled to resolve exact silhouettes through the distortion of re-entry vectors held in reserve, but the propulsion signatures were unmistakably biological in their energy profile. Cecil did not announce the conclusion aloud in the command room, yet every analyst present arrived at the same one. Viltrumite interest had been triggered by the presence of an expanding force on a world already under informal observation. Omni-Man felt it as confirmation of the worst possible timing, because intervention from his own kind would not come with a request for context or a tolerance for anomalies that complicated planetary integration. He adjusted his approach mid-flight, abandoning attempts to herd Jin-Woo toward the lattice's interior, and instead striking to drive him away from the densest concentrations of shadow forces. The intention was not mercy but denial, because a Viltrumite response would interpret the army moving below as territorial violation, regardless of origin. Jin-Woo registered the shift in Omni-Man's tactics and understood that the nature of the conflict had changed again, because an opponent who begins to prioritize separation over elimination is responding to a new variable. He did not waste energy seeking the source in the sky. His priority remained the battlefield at hand, and the need to secure decisive victories before fatigue could erode his capacity to command. The shadows moved in disciplined ranks through corridors the military had abandoned, their advance now focused on infrastructure that would preserve mobility if the fight expanded beyond the current district. Mark, watching the off-world formation through feeds relayed to his visor, realized that whatever was approaching would not see a difference between the anomaly his father was fighting and the defenders attempting to contain it. His attempt to reach Omni-Man through open comms went unanswered as the Viltrumite drove Jin-Woo through another line of shadow constructs, scattering them across a transit interchain that had only just been cleared of civilians. Each defeat at Jin-Woo's hands remained a legitimate addition to his ranks, and the feedback loop the GDA had feared continued to tighten. Above them, one of the approaching signatures detached from the holding pattern and began a controlled descent that ionized the air along its path. The GDA's orbital platforms tracked the entry with a priority that overrode all other telemetry, and emergency channels opened across military networks that had not anticipated extraterrestrial intervention within hours of an urban crisis. Cecil authorized a standing order for all ground units to avoid engagement with the incoming entity until its intent could be assessed, even as he understood that Omni-Man would not have that luxury. The descent did not come with announcement, because Viltrumite doctrine does not require ceremony when responding to potential threats. The figure that entered the atmosphere did so with a trajectory that would intersect the city's perimeter within minutes, and the pressure of its passage rippled through the containment lattice in a way that caused projections to flicker. Jin-Woo felt the disturbance along the connections to his shadows, and adjusted their formation to account for a force he had not yet seen, but could already measure by effect. Omni-Man broke from the immediate engagement to meet the incoming presence beyond the outer districts, because allowing first contact within range of Jin-Woo's army would complicate a response that needed to be decisive. His acceleration carried him beyond the lattice's edge and into the upper air, where the new arrival cut through cloud with an ease that mirrored his own. The exchange that followed was brief and wordless, a confirmation of identity and a recognition that the anomaly below had drawn attention from beyond Earth. On the ground, Jin-Woo did not pursue, because the absence of his primary opponent created an opportunity to consolidate without committing additional mana to direct confrontation. He directed the shadows to secure the nearest communication hub, not for its technology but for its elevation, and positioned himself where shadow exchange would remain viable if the fight expanded into the sky. The military perimeter, already strained by the army's advance, began to contract in response to the new variable descending toward their theater. As the incoming Viltrumite altered course toward the city and Omni-Man moved to intercept, the containment lattice flickered again under stresses it had not been designed to withstand. The shadows continued their disciplined advance through districts that had been evacuated but not yet abandoned, and the knowledge that resistance now included off-world force settled into the ranks of those still fighting. Above the skyline, two trajectories converged with an inevitability that promised escalation no agency could manage. The second Viltrumite did not slow on approach, because the purpose of the descent was not reconnaissance but intervention, and the shockwave from their entry fractured the containment lattice across 3 adjoining districts before ground-based systems could compensate. The distortion rolled outward in a visible ripple that bent the light around the city's skyline, and every shadow bound to Jin-Woo's command registered the interference as a tremor along the connections that held them in formation. Above the cloud layer, Omni-Man met the incoming force with a collision that split the air into a corridor of thunder, confirming without words that the anomaly below had escalated beyond local concern. On the ground, Jin-Woo felt the change in pressure as something older than the fight itself pressed down through atmosphere and infrastructure alike. The shadows did not panic, because panic is a function of the living, but their cohesion required additional mana to maintain as the lattice failed, and the new presence began to alter the battlefield from a distance. He moved toward the secured communication hub he had marked minutes earlier, prioritizing elevation not for advantage against Omni-Man, but for a vantage from which shadow exchange might remain viable if the engagement shifted vertically. Mark saw the 2 figures above the skyline close the distance again, and understood that whatever came next would not distinguish between a city and a battlefield. His attempt to reach evacuation command was interrupted by the arrival of the second Viltrumite within the perimeter, the impact of their landing carving a crater through a commercial district that had only just been cleared of civilians. The devastation was immediate, and before the military units nearby could respond, Jin-Woo had already begun moving toward the impact zone with the same cold priority that had governed every extraction since his arrival. The Viltrumite who had landed did not announce intent, because Viltrumite doctrine interprets the presence of a coordinated, expanding force as occupation regardless of origin. Their first strike targeted the nearest concentration of shadows, scattering them with a force that would have pulverized conventional troops, and the second came for Jin-Woo himself with a trajectory that ignored the remaining structures in its path. He met the attack with a formation drawn from legitimate battlefield victories, using their disciplined advance to disrupt the line long enough to avoid a direct incapacitation. Omni-Man re-entered the engagement a heartbeat later, not to assist Jin-Woo, but to prevent the new arrival from driving the anomaly into the densest remaining population centers. The collision between Viltrumites cracked the crater's rim and sent debris into adjacent streets, and for a moment the fight became a triangle of incompatible objectives: elimination, denial, and survival intersecting in a space too small to contain them. Jin-Woo used the opening created by their clash to confirm defeat among those who had not survived the landing, and the system responded with additional shadows that rose from the wreckage. Extraction from alien physiology remained uncertain, and until he could defeat one outright, the balance would remain tilted toward attrition. He could not afford indefinitely. He did not attempt to test that limit prematurely, conserving mana by directing his army to occupy the military units attempting to re-establish a perimeter, while the Viltrumites engaged each other. The strain of sustained command under this level of interference began to show in the way his movements lost a fraction more of their earlier economy. Above them, orbital platforms recalibrated targeting solutions that no longer accounted for a single hostile anomaly, but for multiple entities capable of reshaping terrain with each exchange. Cecil authorized contingency measures that had been drafted for planetary defense scenarios, even as he understood that deploying them inside an urban environment would produce losses Jin-Woo could convert into strength. The irreversible cost of escalation was no longer theoretical. It was rising from the crater in the form of obedient shadows. The second Viltrumite broke from Omni-Man with an intent that left no room for misinterpretation and drove toward Jin-Woo with a strike calibrated to end the anomaly before it could grow further. Jin-Woo met the advance with a tightening of formation that kept the attacker engaged within reach of targets. The military could not afford to lose, even as fatigue edged closer to something he would have to account for. Their collision tore through the upper levels of the communication hub and into open air beyond. As debris rained across the district and the shadows advanced to fill the space left in his wake, the realization settled across every command channel that this had become a God-level conflict with no mechanism for de-escalation. Omni-Man closed again to prevent the new arrival from isolating Jin-Woo beyond the army's reach, and the city below braced for impacts that would not stop at its borders. The moment the second Viltrumite redirected their assault toward Jin-Woo in open air, the last coordinated elements of the city's defense began to fracture under the weight of decisions that no longer had acceptable outcomes. The communication hub he had secured minutes earlier folded inward as their collision sheared through its upper levels, and the debris that followed did not fall cleanly into evacuated streets, but across military staging zones that had been established to deny him access to fresh casualties. In attempting to protect the anomaly from isolation, Omni-Man had forced the fight into the one place the GDA could least afford to lose, the corridor through which their remaining evacuation convoys were still moving. Jin-Woo felt the feedback of sustained command settle deeper into his reserves as he redirected shadows to occupy the new attacker without committing to a direct contest he could not yet win. Viltrumite durability still exceeded what his current ranks could overcome in a decisive exchange, and every moment spent attempting to break it would be paid for in mana he could not replenish mid-conflict. Instead, he prioritized the confirmation of defeat among those caught beneath the collapsing hub, because each legitimate extraction represented stability in an engagement that was beginning to spin beyond his capacity to control. The second Viltrumite did not adjust for collateral, because their objective remained the elimination of a coordinated, expanding force that represented territorial violation. Their next strike carved through the evacuation corridor itself, collapsing an overpass that had been carrying armored transports and civilian buses alike. The loss was immediate and irreversible, and before rescue teams could breach the wreckage, Jin-Woo's shadows had begun to gather along its edges in disciplined ranks drawn from the fallen. Mark arrived seconds too late to prevent the collapse, his attempt to divert the trajectory interrupted by Omni-Man's renewed engagement with the off-world arrival. The sight that met him below, a convoy turned into a recruitment ground for the very force they had been trying to contain, erased any remaining belief that this could end without permanent change. He moved to pull survivors clear even as the shadows advanced, knowing that every body left within Jin-Woo's reach would strengthen the anomaly's hold on a city that had already given too much. Above them, the orbital platforms prepared to deploy contingency measures that had been drafted for planetary defense rather than urban containment, and Cecil authorized their release with an understanding that the cost would not be limited to infrastructure. The projected field descended in a pattern designed to disrupt mass cohesion across a wider radius than any previous attempt, and when it intersected with Jin-Woo's army, the feedback translated into a momentary instability that forced him to choose between maintaining formation and conserving strength. He chose conservation, allowing outer ranks to disperse rather than contest a field that would bleed him dry if resisted directly, and in doing so ceded ground the military had believed secured. Omni-Man, seeing the contraction, accelerated with an intent that treated delay as defeat, and drove the second Viltrumite away from the densest concentrations of shadow forces. Their collision sent a shockwave through the projected field that caused it to flicker, and the momentary lapse allowed Jin-Woo to re-establish cohesion where it mattered most. The collapse of defense was not a single event, but a sequence of losses that could not be undone, because every attempt to contain the anomaly had produced new additions to his ranks. Military units found their positions overrun not by an invading army, but by constructs drawn from their own failed interventions, and the realization settled into command channels that resistance now meant limiting growth rather than achieving victory. The city's power grid failed entirely under the cumulative damage, plunging districts into a darkness that moved with purpose. Jin-Woo's aura pressed outward in measured pulses as he repositioned along the interior of the projected field, placing himself where shadow exchange would remain viable if the fight expanded beyond the atmosphere. Fatigue edged closer to something he would have to account for, and the knowledge that alien physiology still resisted extraction kept the balance tilted toward attrition he could not afford indefinitely. Until a Viltrumite fell by his hand, the resource he needed to stabilize this war remained out of reach. As the second Viltrumite broke from Omni-Man again and drove toward Jin-Woo with a strike calibrated to incapacitate, the shadows advanced to fill the space left in his wake. The evacuation corridor burned beneath them, and the last organized defense within the district began to fall back toward positions that no longer existed on any map. By the time the projected field began to flicker for the third time, the engagement had ceased to resemble anything that could be managed by doctrine written for cities or nations. The second Viltrumite's repeated attempts to incapacitate Jin-Woo had forced the fight into a rhythm of collisions that reshaped entire blocks, and the shadows that advanced behind their commander moved with a cohesion that no longer depended on visibility. In the darkness left by a failed power grid, their ranks filled streets and transit lines alike, and every confirmed defeat within reach translated into another stable mass the military could neither disperse nor negotiate with. Jin-Woo felt the limit of sustained command approach in a way that could not be ignored, because mana spent maintaining cohesion under Viltrumite-level interference did not return without rest he could not claim. He adjusted the formation again, tightening interior ranks while allowing the outermost constructs to dissolve where pressure peaked, and in doing so created a corridor through which the second Viltrumite advanced with the certainty that the anomaly's army had begun to fail. That certainty was the opening Jin-Woo required, because extraction demands a decisive end, and decisive ends often arrive when an opponent commits fully. Omni-Man saw the corridor form and recognized the trap too late, because his own engagement with the off-world arrival had drawn him beyond immediate intercept range. The The second Viltrumite closed on Jin-Woo with a strike calibrated to shatter the structures behind him and drive the anomaly into open air where isolation would be possible. Jin-Woo did not retreat, because retreat would concede the moment he had been conserving strength to create. Instead, he met the advance with a formation drawn from legitimate battlefield victories and a commitment of mana he could not afford to repeat. The collision that followed tore through the remaining levels of the coordination center and into the street below, driving both combatants into a crater that swallowed the intersection hole. The shadows advanced to occupy the rim, their disciplined ranks preventing military units from intervening as Omni-Man broke from his opponent above and accelerated toward the impact zone. Mark followed with a speed that ignored orders relayed through his visor, because whatever happened next would not wait for authorization. Inside the crater, Jin-Woo absorbed the second Viltrumite's next strike and answered not with a frontal assault, but with a sequence of movements designed to disrupt balance rather than break bone. Viltrumite durability still exceeded what his army could overcome directly, but durability does not negate defeat when leverage is applied to momentum, and momentum was the one variable even this opponent had committed fully. The final exchange drove the Viltrumite into the crater wall, with a force that translated through the ground into a silence that lasted half a breath. That half breath was enough, because defeat recognized by the system does not require death in the way this world defines it. Jin-Woo laid a hand against the fallen opponent and issued the command that had followed him across realities, and for the first time since his arrival, the contract accepted alien physiology as a legitimate target. Extraction was not immediate. It resisted in a way human ends had not, and the mana required to complete it burned through reserves already strained by sustained combat. Omni-Man arrived as the process completed, the sight that met him redefining the fight in a way that could not be undone. Where the second Viltrumite had fallen, a shadow rose that carried the outline of a species his doctrine had never permitted to serve another will. The psychological pressure of Jin-Woo's authority pressed outward as the new addition stabilized, and the army that had been built from sailors, operatives, and civilians alike now included a form capable of matching the durability that had defined this conflict. Mark landed at the crater's edge in time to see his father hesitate for the first time since the engagement had begun, because the fall of a Viltrumite did not represent a tactical loss but a strategic catastrophe. The shadows moved with renewed cohesion behind their commander, and the balance that had tilted toward attrition shifted into something else entirely. Above them, the off-world arrival broke from Omni-Man's earlier engagement and turned toward the crater with an intent that promised escalation beyond anything the GDA could model. As the newly risen shadow took its place among the ranks, and the projected field flickered again under stresses it had not been designed to withstand, the realization settled across every command channel that this loss could not be reversed. Jin-Woo had secured the resource he needed to survive this world scale, and the war that followed would not resemble the one that had begun on a cargo deck hours earlier. The moment the Viltrumite shadow stabilized at Jin-Woo's side, the engagement crossed a threshold that no government, agency, or planetary doctrine had ever prepared to address. The army that had advanced through darkened streets now included a form capable of matching the durability that had defined the conflict from its first clash, and the psychological pressure of Jin-Woo's authority pressed outward in a way that unsettled even those who had not understood what they were watching. The crater that had swallowed the intersection became a point of reference on every remaining feed, because where one of their own had fallen, something else now stood. Omni-Man did not step back from the rim out of fear, but out of calculation, because Viltrumite doctrine required reassessment when an opponent demonstrated the capacity to convert a fallen warrior into an obedient extension of their will. The off-world arrival descended to join him without ceremony, their attention fixed not on the military perimeter collapsing beyond the district, but on the shadow that mirrored their own kind in outline if not in allegiance. The exchange that followed was brief and clinical, a confirmation that planetary integration had been complicated by an anomaly capable of altering the balance of force. Jin-Woo did not advance immediately, because decisive outcomes are secured by timing rather than impulse, and the mana cost of the extraction still burned through reserves he could not replenish in the span of a breath. He directed the newly risen Shadow into formation with the same economy that had governed every edition since his arrival, allowing its presence to anchor a line that had previously relied on numbers rather than parity. The army behind him moved with a cohesion that no longer depended on dispersal under pressure, and the military units attempting to re-establish a perimeter found their positions overrun by a force they could not break without feeding it. Mark watched from the crater's edge as the two Viltrumites adjusted their stance in response to the new variable, and understood that whatever came next would not be confined to the city that had already given too much. His attempt to reach his father was cut short by the renewed engagement, because Omni-Man chose action over debate and drove toward Jin-Woo with a strike intended to end the anomaly before the new Shadow could be fully integrated. Jin-Woo met the advance with a formation that now included parity, and the collision that followed reshaped the crater into something deeper. Above them, orbital platforms recalibrated targeting solutions that no longer accounted for a single hostile entity, but for an army capable of matching off-world durability. Cecil authorized a withdrawal of remaining ground units from the immediate theater, because every engagement inside the district had produced additions to Jin-Woo's ranks that could not be undone. The evacuation that followed was not orderly, because order had been a casualty of decisions made hours earlier, and the city's remaining defenders fell back toward positions that existed only on contingency maps. The off-world arrival joined the fight with an intent that treated the shadowed Viltrumite as an existential threat rather than a tactical problem, and the exchange between them tore through what remained of the coordination center. Jin-Woo conserved strength where he could, directing his army to occupy military assets attempting to deploy new suppression measures, and used Shadow exchange sparingly to maintain a position that kept both Viltrumites within reach of the new addition. Fatigue remained a factor, but the balance had shifted into something survivable. As the projected field failed entirely under the strain of impacts it had not been designed to withstand, the Shadows advanced beyond the district into infrastructure that had been cleared but not yet abandoned. Transit lines, communication towers, and emergency staging areas fell in sequence, not to an invading army but to constructs drawn from the city's losses. The world watching understood that containment had become a memory, because the force moving through the dark did not require permission to cross municipal boundaries. Omni-Man broke from the immediate clash long enough to assess the scale of what had been created, and the hesitation that followed was not retreat but recognition that planetary control now required a different response. The off-world arrival mirrored the pause, their attention shifting from Jin-Woo himself to the army that could no longer be dismissed as collateral. Jin-Woo did not pursue beyond the edge of his formation, because unnecessary confrontation remained a waste of strength he would need for what came next. By dawn, the city that had hosted the first clash existed as a proving ground for a new balance of power, its infrastructure repurposed by shadows that moved with disciplined intent. Governments adjusted their threat assessments in real time, and orbital platforms shifted from containment to observation, because intervention had produced a result they could not reverse. The decisive outcome was not the defeat of a Viltrumite or the collapse of a defense grid, but the establishment of an independent force on Earth that answered to no nation and could not be negotiated into compliance. The world did not return to normal, because normal had depended on the assumption that power could be contained within familiar limits. Sung Jin-Woo had arrived without invitation and secured the one resource that allowed him to survive this world scale, and in doing so had forced every defender of Earth to account for a war that would not be fought on their terms. Above the scarred skyline, the off-world observers adjusted their orbit, and below it the shadows continued to move.